In April 1864, Spanish warships moved against a handful of barren islands off the coast of Peru. There was no gold there, no city, no fortress worth conquering. What the islands held was bird waste. Mountains of it. For centuries, seabirds had covered the Chincha Islands with guano rich in the nutrients exhausted European farms desperately wanted. By the 19th century, that waste had become valuable enough to finance governments, attract foreign creditors, and turn remote rocks in the Pacific into strategic territory. But the ships were only one part of the story. Below the cliffs, workers hacked at compressed guano with picks and shovels. Many were Chinese contract laborers brought across the Pacific into a system of debt, punishment, isolation, and control so severe that guards were used to keep men from escaping the islands. Thousands of miles away, farmers saw something very different. Higher yields, better soil, more food. Guano looked like an agricultural miracle. So how did bird droppings become powerful enough to enrich a nation, reshape foreign policy, and make one man's fertile field depend on another man's confinement? Long before guano became one of the strangest commodities of the 19th century, the islands off Peru were already doing something extraordinary. Along the Pacific coast, enormous colonies of seabirds fed in one of the richest marine ecosystems on Earth. Generation after generation returned to the same dry islands. And because rain was so scarce, what they left behind did not simply wash into the sea. It accumulated, layer after layer, year after year. In some places, the deposits grew into landscapes of their own. To an outsider, it could look like little more than pale dirt with an unbearable smell. To farmers along the Peruvian coast, it was something far more useful. They had known that for centuries. Long before European merchants began shipping guano across the Atlantic, indigenous communities in Peru were using seabird manure to restore nutrients to agricultural land. Colonial chroniclers described coastal farmers collecting the dung of seabirds from offshore islands, while the word itself came from the Quechua guano, meaning manure. Before the boom, the process was small enough to picture. A small boat approaches an island crowded with birds. Men load the material by hand, carry it back toward the coast, and move it inland toward fields that need feeding. There is no global fertilizer company, no London commodity market, no government debt tied to the cargo. The material belongs to a regional agricultural system whose value is already understood by the people using it. Europe arrived late to that knowledge. In 1802, while traveling through Peru, the Prussian naturalist Alexander von Humboldt encountered guano and became interested in its agricultural value. Samples later reached Europe, where chemists examined a substance that seemed almost comically humble beside the minerals, metals, and exotic plants usually associated with scientific exploration. But guano had an unusual advantage. Plants remove nutrients from soil. Harvest after harvest, those nutrients have to be replaced. Farmers had always found ways to do that: animal manure, crop rotation, fallowing, plant residues. Guano offered something unusually concentrated and transportable. That difference would soon matter enormously. At first, however, European interest was limited. Samples could be analyzed. Experiments could be performed. None of that automatically created an industry. For an industry, guano needed something else. It needed farmers willing to buy fertility from thousands of miles away. It needed merchants willing to gamble on ships full of foul-smelling powder. It needed ports, contracts, warehouses, advertisements, and a market convinced that the soil beneath a British field could be repaired with materials scraped from a Peruvian island. By the late 1830s, merchants were beginning to test exactly that possibility. In 1839, a small shipment of Peruvian guano reached Liverpool. It was hardly the beginning of a mass trade, but it was enough to open the door. The great transformation in guano's history was not that Europeans discovered what it could do. People in Peru already knew. The transformation came when Europe realized that fertility itself could be packaged, loaded onto a ship, carried across an ocean, and sold. Once British farmers began seeing what that cargo could do to exhausted land, the experiment would become a rush, and the quiet islands would become extraction sites. In the 1840s, European farmers began buying something their own farms had never produced: fertility from another continent. At a British port, the cargo did not look impressive. Sailors hauled sacks from a ship that had crossed the Atlantic and rounded the long route from Peru. Dockworkers stacked them beside timber, grain, hides, and all the other materials arriving from overseas. Open one, and there was no jewel or spice inside, only a dry, pale, foul-smelling powder. But spread that powder over a field, and farmers noticed the difference. British agriculture was already becoming more commercial and more scientific. Farmers wanted larger harvests from land that could not simply be wrested whenever nutrients ran low. Animal manure remained essential, and bones were already being bought as fertilizer. But guano arrived with unusually concentrated plant nutrients and an almost theatrical reputation for effectiveness. A farmer could slit a sack with a knife, scoop out the powder, and scatter it across wheat, turnips, or grass. The smell was memorable. So were the results when it was used successfully. Agricultural journals, merchants, experiments, and word of mouth helped turn curiosity into demand. The numbers show how quickly that curiosity became an industry. Peru recorded guano exports of just over 8,000 metric tons in 1841. In 1847, exports reached more than 96,000 tons. By 1849, they had passed 151,000. In 1854, Peru exported more than 533,000 metric tons. The boom was no longer an experiment. Britain became the most important market. In the 1850s, roughly half of Peru's guano exports went there, and for a period it appears to have been the principal commercial manure purchased by British farmers. That meant something new was happening in the field. A farmer in Norfolk or Yorkshire no longer had to depend only on nutrients circulating within his own local landscape. The fertility removed in a harvest could be partly replaced with material created by seabirds on islands off South America. The farm had acquired an overseas supply line. Follow one sack backward, and the scale becomes clearer. A merchant sells it inland. Before him, a warehouse holds hundreds more. Before the warehouse, dock workers unload a ship. Before the ship, laborers in Peru fill its hold. And before any shovel touches the deposit, countless seabirds have spent generations concentrating nutrients from the Pacific food web onto dry islands where almost no rain carries them away. Agricultural productivity and maritime trade were now connected by a substance most people would once have considered waste. That connection also changed how guano was valued. To a farmer, it was a way to push more growth from a field. To a merchant, it was a commodity with rapidly expanding demand. To the Peruvian state, it was becoming revenue on a scale that could transform public finance. And every increase in demand created pressure at the place where the entire trade began. British farmers did not need to see that pressure. Their part of the transaction ended when the sacks arrived and the crops grew. On the Chincha Islands, the opposite was happening. The more miraculous guano appeared in a European field, the more material had to be cut from the islands, moved to the shore, and loaded into ships. Birds had created the deposits. Now an industry needed men to dismantle them. Guano was made by birds. The guano industry was built by men with picks, shovels, carts, ropes, and ships. By the middle of the 19th century, arriving at the Chincha Islands meant entering something closer to a mine than a bird colony. The deposits that had accumulated over generations were no longer simply part of the landscape, they were inventory. A laborer could begin before sunrise. Guano dug the previous day had to be broken loose, shoveled into carts, moved across the island, gathered for loading, and sent toward ships waiting offshore. The work was repetitive and physical. Pick into the packed deposit, shovel, lift, load, move, then do it again. There was little machinery to hide the human effort. Contemporary accounts describe workers cutting into the guano with picks and shovels, then moving it in carts, sometimes along simple railways or with mules. The islands were being reorganized around one purpose: getting as much fertilizer as possible from the deposit into the hold of a ship. Look at the trade from offshore, and the scale becomes clearer. In 1857 alone, a United States congressional report recorded 620 vessels loaded with guano at the Chincha Islands. British and American ships dominated the traffic. Peru's total guano exports that year exceeded 626,000 metric tons. Every ton had to pass through a sequence of physical movements. Someone loosened it, someone shoveled it, someone moved it toward the loading point, someone got it aboard. Then a sailing vessel carried it away from the barren islands toward farms in Britain, the United States, France, and elsewhere. The contrast was almost absurd. On one side of the world, a farmer might handle guano by the handful. On the Chinchas, workers confronted it as terrain. A worker could stand beside a deposit with a shovel and watch another ship appear beyond the cliffs. Its arrival did not mean the work was nearly finished. It meant another cargo space had opened that had to be filled. And the ships kept coming. The trade had expanded so quickly that loading itself became a commercial problem. Contractors competed over the cost and speed of moving guano onto vessels. Shipowners complained about delays. In 1854, British discussion of the trade included reports of valuable ships waiting at the Chinchas for weeks, sometimes around 80 days because they could not be loaded quickly enough. The bottleneck was not whether anyone wanted guano. The bottleneck was how fast human beings could remove it. That distinction matters because the islands were not producing a manufactured good. There was no machine making fresh guano at the pace of demand. The valuable deposit had already been created over a much longer biological timescale. Industrialization, here, meant speeding up its destruction. A cliff face became tonnage. A cart became throughput. A ship's empty hold became a deadline. And the enormous export figures that looked impressive in government records were built from thousands upon thousands of ordinary motions performed by workers whose names rarely appeared in those records. For Peru, the numbers were extraordinary. Guano exports had climbed from only 8,085 metric tons in 1841 to more than 500,000 in several years of the 1850s. By 1870, they would reach a recorded peak of more than 728,000 metric tons. But long before that peak, the basic problem was already visible. The deposits were vast. Foreign demand was rising. Ships were waiting. What the guano economy did not have in unlimited supply was labor willing to live on remote islands and keep digging at the speed the market demanded. That problem would push the industry toward a very different kind of import. Not fertilizer, people. The labor shortage was solved on paper with contracts. On the Chincha Islands, those contracts could look very different. Beginning in 1849, growing numbers of Chinese men were transported across the Pacific to Peru. They would eventually work on plantations, railways, in households, and in the guano trade. Many signed agreements binding them to years of labor. The documents made them contract workers. The route that brought some of them there was far less orderly. In southern Chinese ports, recruiters were paid for the men they supplied. Some prospective migrants were promised good wages and opportunity abroad. Others entered through debt. Historical investigations also describe deception, coercion, and cases of kidnapping as the demand for workers increased. Once recruited, a man might be confined in a guarded depot until a ship was ready. Then came the Pacific. Picture the lower deck of an emigrant vessel leaving China. Men who may have known almost nothing about Peru are packed together for a voyage lasting weeks. Food and water have to survive the crossing. Disease spreads easily. Discipline can turn violent. British officials examining the trade later described severe overcrowding, poor nourishment, sickness, harsh punishment, mutiny, and high mortality aboard vessels carrying Chinese laborers to Peru. Those who survived still had not reached the place where many would work. Most Chinese arrivals were sent elsewhere in Peru, but some were transferred to the Guano Islands. By 1853, nearly 600 Chinese laborers were reportedly working on the Chinchas, forming roughly two-thirds of the workforce there. Now return to the man with the shovel. The contract may say he owes years of labor. The island says something more. There is ocean in almost every direction. Ships appear offshore constantly, but they are cargo vessels, not tickets home. Work is supervised. Discipline can be severe, and guards are stationed in part to prevent laborers from escaping onto foreign ships. That detail changes the meaning of the contract. At the end of another day inside the guano workings, A laborer could look up and see a foreign vessel anchored beyond the cliffs. It will leave, you may not. In 1854, more than 40 Chinese workers did manage to escape and reach Lima. Their flight survives in the archival record as a small line in a much larger trade, but it raises a much larger question. If these men were simply free employees fulfilling ordinary contracts, why did they need to escape? Contemporary observers were asking similar questions. In July 1854, the British government received reports from shipmasters who had returned from the Chincha Islands. The language used by British officials was unusually severe. They demanded that Peru investigate what they regarded as brutal treatment of Chinese laborers involved in guano export. This does not mean Chinese indenture and African chattel slavery were legally identical. They were not. The distinction matters. But legal classification alone does not tell us how much meaningful freedom a worker possessed. Recruitment could involve deception. Departure could begin under debt. The contract could bind him for years. Punishment could follow resistance. Armed supervision could limit his ability to leave. The timing made the contradiction even sharper. On the 3rd of December 1854, Ramon Castilla issued the decree abolishing slavery in Peru. That was a profound legal change, but abolition did not abolish the economic demand for cheap, controllable labor. Coastal plantations still needed workers. Railways needed workers. The Guano Islands needed workers. Chinese indenture helped fill that gap. A society could therefore eliminate one legal institution of forced labor while allowing another labor system to operate under the language of contract. And thousands of miles away, almost none of this was visible. A farmer saw a sack. A merchant saw a price. A government official saw export revenue. The Chinese laborer saw the remaining years on his agreement and the ship beyond the cliffs. Guano had solved one problem for industrial agriculture: how to restore exhausted soil. But its success created another problem for the people selling it. How do you keep extracting more when too few people willingly accept the work? For a time, the answer was to make labor look free on paper, while making departure extraordinarily difficult in practice. Soon, however, guano would create a different kind of struggle. Governments themselves would begin competing for the islands. Once guano became valuable enough, governments stopped treating it like manure and started treating it like territory. American farmers were among those complaining about price and supply. Imported Peruvian guano worked, but dependence on a foreign monopoly was expensive and politically uncomfortable. The obvious solution was not to use less fertilizer. It was to find more islands. In Washington, that search became law. On the 18th of August, 1856, Congress passed what became known as the Guano Islands Act. Its language was startlingly direct. If an American citizen discovered guano on an island, rock, or key outside the lawful jurisdiction of another government and took peaceful possession, the president could treat that place as appertaining to the United States. The law even protected the resulting trade. Guano taken from qualifying islands was to be delivered for American use, and federal law allowed the government to protect American rights there. Unfold a chart of the Pacific or Caribbean in the 1850s. Most of the marks are tiny. Some are little more than rocks rising from the ocean. They have no cities, no farms, perhaps no permanent population at all. But if seabirds had been using one long enough, that rock might suddenly have value. Private adventurers and merchants began filing claims. Fertilizer had turned geography itself into a commercial opportunity. The law sounds almost absurd now. A republic extending its legal reach over remote rocks because those rocks carried fertilizer deposits. But the farmers buying guano did not see a joke. They saw nitrogen, phosphorus, higher yields, and a way to avoid dependence on Peru's prices. Peru understood the stakes even more clearly. By the 1860s, the Chincha Islands were not simply the source of a useful export. They were tied to one of the republic's most important streams of revenue. That made them an obvious point of pressure. In 1863, a violent incident at the Talambo estate involving Spanish residents deepened an already difficult diplomatic relationship between Spain and Peru. Madrid sent officials and naval forces into a dispute that quickly became larger than the original incident. Then, On the 14th of April, 1864, Spanish forces seized the Chincha Islands. Picture the scene from the water. Spanish warships lie offshore. Sailors move onto islands whose cliffs have spent years feeding ships bound for foreign farms. A flag is raised above deposits that Peru has been turning into revenue by the hundreds of thousands of tons. Spain had not seized the islands because officials suddenly cared about fertilizer. The dispute involved diplomatic claims, national honor, unresolved tensions, and competing interpretations of Spain's relationship with its former colony. But choosing the Chinchas as leverage was no accident. Seizing them meant putting a hand on one of Peru's most valuable assets. American diplomatic correspondence from the crisis repeatedly referred to Spain's seizure of the Chincha Islands. Peru, in turn, sought warships to defend its coasts and Guano Islands. Later, Spanish proposals even contemplated controlling the proceeds from guano sales. While the dispute continued, the commodity had crossed another boundary. First, guano had been local agricultural knowledge. Then it became fertilizer cargo. Then an export industry. Now naval power stood over the deposits. The shift reveals how quickly an ordinary material can change once an economy becomes dependent on it. A rock that nobody wanted could become strategically important because birds had spent centuries leaving nutrients on it. Yet the largest transformation was still happening somewhere less dramatic than a warship. It was happening in ledgers. Peru had discovered that guano could do more than produce crops and export revenue. Expected shipments could support loans. Future deposits could support present spending. The islands were about to become something even stranger than territory. They were about to become collateral. The strangest transformation in guano's history happened when the fertilizer stopped being fertilizer at all. It became credit. By the late 1860s, Peru had spent decades turning seabird deposits into government revenue. Guano sales helped fund the state, pay creditors, and support ambitious public works. As long as foreign buyers kept paying for shipments, the islands seemed to offer something almost magical: income that could be converted into roads, railways, salaries, and loans. In a banking office in Paris, there did not need to be a single bird in sight. There were contracts instead. In 1869, the Peruvian government reached an agreement with Dreyfus Brothers and Company that gave the firm sweeping rights to sell Peruvian guano in European markets. Dreyfus would handle major sales, make advances to the government, and help service Peru's foreign obligations from the proceeds. On paper, the arrangement did something remarkable. It turned expected future shipments into financial capacity in the present. Peru had a valuable export. European buyers wanted it. A powerful commercial house could convert expected shipments into cash and credit. That mattered because Peru was trying to build at extraordinary speed. Railway lines were being pushed across some of the hardest terrain in South America. Engineers, contractors, imported equipment, laborers, bridges, tunnels, and locomotives all had to be paid for. To political leaders, railways promised more than transportation. They promised integration, development, and a future economy no longer dependent on a single export. But that future was being financed with the very dependence they hoped to escape. A railway could be cutting inland while, hundreds of miles away, workers continued loading guano onto ships. The connection between the two is not visible in the landscape. It is visible in the ledger. A shipment reaches Europe, guano is sold. Proceeds are assigned to bond interest, advances, and public works. More money is borrowed. More construction is authorized. Expected export revenue begins supporting commitments already made in the present. By 1873, an American diplomat in Lima described the relationship plainly. Dreyfus Brothers held the exclusive right to ship and sell government guano in Europe. The firm was expected to use the proceeds to pay interest on Peruvian bonds and supply funds for public works, including railroads. The arrangement reveals the danger more clearly than any single year of export statistics can. The islands were still being dug, but financially, much of their future income had already been spoken for. A sack sold today could help pay interest on money borrowed yesterday for a railway that was supposed to create prosperity tomorrow. Each link depended on the next one holding. Exports had to remain strong enough. Prices had to remain favorable enough. Deposits had to remain productive enough. Foreign creditors had to remain confident. And the state had to keep finding revenue to honor obligations created during the boom. For years, guano had made Peru appear extraordinarily wealthy because the country controlled a resource that much of the agricultural world wanted. But wealth stored in a finite deposit is not the same as an endless income stream. The birds had accumulated the resource slowly. Governments, merchants, contractors, and creditors had learned to spend its value much faster. By the early 1870s, the danger was becoming harder to ignore. Peru was no longer simply selling what the islands contained. It was committing future guano revenue to obligations created in the present. And when confidence in that future began to weaken, the fertilizer boom would reveal its final lesson. The deposits could lose their dominance. The economic logic built around imported fertility would survive. By the 1870s, the age when Peruvian guano seemed almost limitless was beginning to fracture. The richest deposits had been worked hard. Quality varied. Export volumes swung sharply from year to year, while farmers and merchants had more alternatives than they had possessed at the beginning of the boom. Guano did not vanish overnight. Peru would continue exporting it. What disappeared was the assumption that these islands could remain the unquestioned center of the fertilizer trade forever. Agriculture did not respond by demanding less from the soil. It searched for another source. In the arid lands of Peru and what would become northern Chile, nitrate deposits offered another concentrated form of plant nutrient. During the 1870s, nitrate extraction in Tarapacá was already expanding as guano lost its old dominance. After the War of the Pacific, Chile emerged with control of major nitrate regions, and the saltpeter trade became one of the great export industries of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Phosphate fertilizers developed along another path. Mineral phosphate could be chemically treated and turned into fertilizers that farmers did not have to wait for seabirds to produce. The source changed. The expectation did not. A farmer could buy nutrients that had been extracted, processed, transported, and sold by someone else, then apply them to land expected to produce another commercial harvest. That logic became even more powerful in the 20th century. Nitrogen presented a particular problem. The atmosphere contains an enormous supply of it, but most crops cannot use nitrogen gas directly. Scientists had long wanted a practical way to convert atmospheric nitrogen into compounds agriculture could use. Fritz Haber found a way to synthesize ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen. Carl Bosch and his colleagues then turned the chemistry into an industrial high-pressure process. By around 1913, synthetic ammonia could be produced on a factory scale. Now the visual changes completely. On the Chincha Islands, fertility had required birds, dry climate, centuries of accumulation, shovels, carts, and ships. Inside a chemical plant, steel vessels, high pressure, hydrogen, and nitrogen from the air could produce the starting material for nitrogen fertilizer continuously. The bird colony was no longer necessary. Neither was a mountain of ancient guano. The capacity to supply nitrogen had moved from a rare natural deposit into industrial infrastructure. That was a much larger revolution than the guano merchants of the 1840s could have imagined, but it also preserved the habit their trade had helped normalize. Intensive agriculture could draw nutrients from a supply network far beyond the boundary of the farm. Today, the materials are different. Nitrogen fertilizer can begin with air and energy. Phosphorus is mined from phosphate rock. Potassium is mined from potash deposits. All of them can cross national borders before reaching a field. Guano did not create that entire system by itself. It was an early, dramatic demonstration of what such a system could do. A remote deposit could raise yields somewhere else. A farmer could become dependent on a nutrient source he never saw. Extraction could be separated from consumption by oceans. The 19th century eventually stopped treating Peruvian guano as the indispensable fertilizer it had once seemed to be. It did not abandon the search for more fertility. It industrialized it. Tomorrow, a handful of fertilizer may look almost meaningless. Dry granules, a sack in a shed, a line on a farm invoice. Nothing about it suggests warships, guarded islands, contracts signed across an ocean, or men digging into cliffs of bird waste under the Pacific sun. But that is what guano changed. It showed the 19th century that fertility did not have to remain where nature placed it. It could be collected, concentrated, priced, loaded into a ship, sent to another country, turned into higher yields, government revenue, territorial claims, debt payments, and eventually an entire industry built around supplying soil with nutrients from somewhere else. That achievement was real. Guano helped farmers restore exhausted land. It increased agricultural productivity. It gave governments and merchants access to a resource that seemed, for a time, almost miraculous. But miracles look different depending on where you stand. From a British field, guano could mean healthier crops. From a Peruvian ledger, it could mean revenue. From the deck of a Spanish warship, it could mean leverage. From the Chincha Islands, it could mean another day with a shovel, another contract still unfinished, and another ship leaving without you. The deposits eventually lost their dominance. Nitrates, phosphates, and synthetic nitrogen took their place. The modern fertilizer bag no longer needs to contain seabird waste from Peru, but the old question remains inside it. Where did these nutrients come from? Who extracted them? What landscape was transformed so this field could remain productive? And how much of that cost disappears before the product reaches the person who benefits from it? Guano was never simply a bizarre chapter in agricultural history. It was an early demonstration of a modern promise, that nature's limits could be pushed back if enough material could be found somewhere else and moved to where it was needed. The islands are no longer at the center of world agriculture. The logic is, guano disappeared from most fields long ago. The world it helped create did not.